Welcome to the Gnarly Girls podcast.
What's up, gnarly beings?
This is a loose-lipped, unfiltered, raw-dogging, stripping down of culture.
No fucks, no panties. This is a labia of love.
We're your hosts, Tony Naj
and Serafina Supernova. And this is Gnarly Girls.
Welcome to Gnarly Girls. Today's episode, Snow White Supremacy.
Let's go into the enchanted forest.
I love that for us. All right. I think, Sarah, that we do want to establish to everybody that we are better than them and we are less racist than all people. So I think that's part of the conversation, is just being morally superior.
Yeah. I mean, how are we going to talk about Snow White supremacy unless we embody it, bitch?
And part of being Snow White supremacy is just thinking that everything and nothing applies to you. Everything is about me, and also it's not about me because I'm not the one doing it. But I am the one affected. But it's not me, but it's me.
Self-importance. On a platter. Here we go.
Here we go. So one of the things that I was thinking about and wanted to ask you and wanted to kind of uncover for ourselves is, for you personally, you grew up in the South, I grew up in the North. So we do have these different cultural perspectives. And I'm curious, when did you start to become aware of race in your childhood?
I feel like from the start, like in church, at school, in my community. I grew up in Davidson, North Carolina, and there was very much so like a part of town that was separated by quite literal train tracks. And the white people in town used to say, oh, the house is on the other side of the tracks. So this sort of like racist, white supremacist mindset was in the fabric of my town and the way that white adults talked about race. Like it was pretty immediately present.
And were you questioning it, or were you like, yeah, okay, not really thinking about it too much?
I was questioning it because of my parents' orientation. Like my parents are both from New York, and so they didn't have some of the same kind of Southern ideologies that I feel like a lot of my teachers and friends' parents had. Like my mom was very outwardly anti-racist in her own way, I'd say. And like that was also a reoccurring theme. And she was friends with a lot of folks in the Black community, like through church, through town, through gardening, like whatever it was. Like I will definitely give my mom props for like just being aware of what was happening and being like, whoa, this is, you know, not that the Northeast doesn't have its own ways of dealing with race, but I think to her and my dad, it was pretty apparent that there was like a very different way of dealing with it. And then this town was also a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, which, you know, has its own connections to Atlanta and like deep, rich Black history in the South. So yeah, it was present. It was very present.
So for me personally, I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I went to a very liberal, quote unquote, school that saw itself as very progressive. And I was growing up in a Harvard dorm, so there was an intellectual kind of aspect of my life that I was exposed to. So I think growing up in that type of liberal environment, nobody thinks they are racist. And what I thought and what I was exposed to at my school was the way that it was presented to us was that racism was a problem of the past. It was something that happened, and it's not something that's currently rampant, you know? And I think that was something that as a young child, I was like, it started to question. And I think one of the things for me that was really big was we were exposed to this film called Eyes on the Prize in the 5th grade. Have you ever heard of this documentary? So it's a documentary about the civil rights movement, and it's showing a lot of footage, you know, of protests, of Black people getting hosed by the hoses, by Black students getting harassed when they're trying to integrate the schools. And we were all watching it as a class. We watched the whole documentary series, and there were far less Black students at my liberal private high school than white students. And I remember watching this and thinking to myself, holy fuck, how do these kids feel watching this surrounded by white people?
Yeah.
Like I was like, this feels rude. But at the same time, for me as a white person to see that was life-changing. It was truly life-changing. I am grateful that the school presented this information to us. They also showed us roots. They were showing us media, but again, everything was contained in the past as if it wasn't our current problem. And there was no trauma-informed conversation around the Black students on how they should like deal, handle, feel, whatever, of having to like have this exposure to this violence surrounded by white people. Make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And another thing that I felt was really poorly done at my school, which was again a very, liberal school that saw itself as part of the solution, I'm sure, is the way that we learned about the Civil War in high school. So, junior year, we're learning American history. It was definitely like the Northerners knew slavery was wrong, and the Southerners just believed that Black people weren't people, and the Northerners didn't agree with that. Like there was no conversation around the economics of slavery. There was no conversation around how the North was intricately involved in slavery. There was no conversation around capitalism. It was literally just a moral conversation about how the Northerners were morally superior than these like basically stupid Southerners. And that is why the North wanted to abolish slavery, and I remember also then being like, what? Like, doesn't add up. So these were kind of my first like major moments of just really questioning the adult perspective of racism.
It's so interesting because that's sort of like how the South teaches about racism, Southeast versus the Northeast. And it's interesting to hear that's what was coming through because in the South, there was this sort of like doubling down on Southern pride. And I think something, I was in high school from 2008 to 2011-ish, that like time period. And I feel like there was still not an understanding of how to separate Southern pride from racism. Like, unfortunately, they were intertwined. And as a person who like never really felt Southern pride, like now I actually feel Southern living in the Northeast after growing up in the South. But at the time, my orientation was like, oh, my parents are Northerners. I don't have a Southern accent. Like I'm not from the South. Like I don't have these same rituals. I don't have this loyalty. But to be saturated in groups of people who did have that loyalty and did feel like they had a right to that and didn't understand how they were upholding racist ideology or white supremacist ideology and then also quote unquote benefiting from it, which as we know, no one really benefits from white supremacy at like a soul level in the same way nobody benefits from patriarchy. But that wasn't something being talked about, certainly. I mean, anti-racist was not something you would have heard in my high school classroom. I think I've said it before on Gnarly Girls, like my history teacher literally gave extra credit if you joined Young Republicans Club. So you had to really make this choice to like individuate. And like, not that my high school was in the inner city, but it was like, it was there. And so it was like a very like, socioeconomic scaled out school from like the poorest folks to the richest folks in Charlotte attending the same public school that was overpopulated. So the race relations were intense. There was like lots of fights and lots of butt grabbing. I definitely had like a couple of sexual assault moments that felt like they were racially charged.
Like you were a white girl?
Yeah, with like a big ass. and titties.
So white girl, big ass titties meant that like there was like you felt that the sexual harassment that came towards you from, I'm assuming, Black students was racially charged.
More so like you got this like mark from white men. Like I never felt in danger in Black spaces. I actually felt there was almost like this protection from like truly these like white supremacist frat boys. I'm like, well, at least this Black dude's grabbing my ass. These fucking white men just start trying to like drug and rape me. Like, I don't know. I'll take an ass grab in the hallway over a fucking rape.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think
like, do I want a rich white prick or do I want this hot Black dude grabbing my ass? I mean, if those are my choices.
well, I think what we're talking about is masculinity within racial dynamics.
He's my class.
One of the things that I was kind of thinking about, you know, when it's like with Dave Chappelle and Dave Chappelle's kind of conversations around the LGBTQ community and a lot of Black comics, right, that have like made homophobic remarks or, you know, anti-queer remarks in the past. And I've thought, I mean, I've thought about this a lot around homophobia in general and how that is integrated with race. Because when you think about slavery, slavery is domination of someone's body, and it's domination of them in a way that is, I'm not saying it's sexual inherently, but there is an emasculinization, right? When someone is a quote unquote slave master and then they're dominating the men's bodies, you know, and then that relationship of impacting masculinity, right? So when there's homophobia in the Black community and like deep homophobia that comes back from like centuries and centuries, I feel like it's very connected to slavery and very connected to men's bodies being dominated, abused. I mean, I'm sure, I mean, definitely raped, but also just having no autonomy over your own body and then being controlled by other men who are oftentimes physically inferior too, you know, like it's not like these slave masters were like super buff and could beat these guys up. No, there was an economic, psychological, structural stronghold that was happening within this country, and that kind of humiliation, I think, is rooted in homophobia and fear, the fear and the aspect of like uncomfortability around male domination, which is also a part of, you know, why I think there is this kind of like uncomfortableness in like, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, I'm pontificating, but I think it needs to be discussed and like thought about. Like what homophobia, we all know with like the Christian kind of homophobia that a lot of them are closeted gay. And I don't think that these Black men are closeted gay. I think this is a trauma response to slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a white woman, something I've always been maybe aware of and curious about is the kind of power and privilege I hold in relationship to Black men, and how at the end of the day, like, even though I am a woman, like, the level of respect that maybe the cis heteronormative white supremacist patriarchy would give me is different than that of a Black man. And that just feels like part of my own deconditioning journey is understanding that me recognizing like what a Black man is holding in his DNA and his tissues is just a different kind of trauma than I may have, even as a woman, even as someone who maybe came from an impoverished lineage of like its own form of enslavement and servitude and rape and whatever, that's different than being a Black man in America, and like what it means also to be a Black person in the United States of America.
Yeah, and women also understand what it is to be property, right?
Yeah.
So when I think of the danger of a white woman to a Black man, I think of how many false rape accusations that there were against Black men at a certain time, where white women would accuse a Black man and then he would, be hung. Like the consequences were dire.
Yeah.
And the false accusing, right? So using your power to bring down the other property. And it's like, when I think about white supremacy with white women, I think that racism is so important because at least you're not Black. You may be property to the white man, but at least you're not Black. And where I think that that's really misguided, because Black is a role, right? Like Black is not the construct of race. I mean, we should also talk about that. I know. Let me just like back up and say that whiteness wasn't even a thing until the 1600s, and that it really did come, as far as my historical knowledge knows, from this rebellion. I think it was Bacon's rebellion, where he was bringing together white slaves, white indentured servants, Black slaves, and Native Americans to fight against the British. And the British were like, absolutely not. This is not going to work. This is actually really dangerous if the white indentured servants, the Black slaves, and the Native Americans all fight together. So what we're going to do is we're going to give the whites a slight amount of privilege because we can distinguish them and they quote unquote look like us. So there was like an economic decision to give whites privilege, which is the birth of white privilege. And that was in the 1600s. So that was when whiteness was born, not racism necessarily, but whiteness. And so when I think about the role of Blackness in America, it's fulfilling a role of the subjugated, right? And so whites understand that. White supremacists really understand that. Even the poorest of whites get, I can be the poorest of whites, but I will be better off than a Black person because of my white privilege. And that's the irony why we're the supreme race, but we're not privileged. But of course, I feel like white supremacists understand white privilege more than anyone else, yet they have this posturing as though, why am I privileged? I'm poor, like, no, you know exactly what's going on. So that rhetoric is kind of interesting.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I had written down to ask you, prompt us around is like, what is racism? What is white supremacy? Like in our sort of understanding of it, how would we give it definition or meaning or describe it? And what I kind of landed on was like, I was like, okay, is it a system? Is it an identity? Is it an ideology? White supremacy specifically. And then I was like, racism, like, of course, it's this very real, like, consciousness virus that plays out, but it's also an ideology. Then I was like, okay, well, what's an ideology? And Google said, a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy. And I was like, oh, that is so interesting in terms of how white supremacy is playing out right now on a policy level. And I think that I'm not surprised by any defunding or shifting of economic resources that are happening, but I feel affected. I'm watching people be affected. And as we know, like money and capitalism have everything to do with like upholding the mirage of white supremacy as well.
The inauguration happening on Martin Luther King Day. And then one of the first things he does is like, no more Black History Month. We're done with Black History Month. I mean, that is
pretty good. That impression.
That was so rude. I feel like rude. Even the KKK was like, what?
That's funny.
Like I felt like that was such a bold move to do that. Like, and what that is about is that's about emboldening white supremacy. that move was about, no. It is time for your racist flags to fly. Like that, I feel like was a message to the public. And I've noticed a lot since the Trump presidency, there's a lot more trolling. There's a lot more aggressiveness. There's a lot more people who are feeling like, okay, now it's my time again. I couldn't say that before and now I can say it.
Oh,
And
get a personality.
pardon?
I'm just like, get a personality. It's just so fucking boring.
Well, speaking about personality, I'm not sure if you witnessed, but at one of the Trump rallies, all these white supremacists were wearing coordinated fits. Like that means like literally if you were in the Proud Boys, you were like texting other Proud Boys and were like, hey, what are you going to wear to the rally? And then the other one's like, I don't know. Should we like match?
Too bad in a New Earth we're doing telepathy. Like get with the program.
No. They were coordinating outfits, Sarah. They were truly coordinating fits like teenage girls.
Right. And what I'm saying is like,
another group that was like, I can't remember the Patriot Pact. I can't remember what they're called. And they had another fit. So the Proud Boys had a certain swag. They had literally merch that they're buying that has their branded logo on it. And then the Patriot Front or whatever they're called, they had the more like white masks, the more like almost like Middle Eastern, like we'll only look at our eyes kind of thing, like the more demure, you know?
I'm just like, look at my pit stains. How does that make all of these white supremacists feel? It smells like BO and I don't respect you.
But you get it? They were creating aesthetic, and that aesthetic was about belonging, and that aesthetic was about a presentation to others. So it's like we're belonging in a group, like teen girls that want to belong as a part of a group, and this is the aesthetic that you, the rest of the public, can wear in order to be a part of our group of white supremacy. And this is what I think the current administration understands, is that this is not only an identity and a personality and an ideology, but it is a community.
Yeah.
And people are craving community, and they're like, oh, now I can be a part of this community and this can be my friend group and I don't have to be so lonely. You know?
Yeah.
So, and like when I think about, I don't know how many podcasts you've listened to about former white supremacists who like talk about their experience. But there is one guy and he's really cool. He, was a radicalized skinhead. And then he eventually left the group and has been working to like reform people who also want to leave the group. Really cool guy. I mean, I think there's probably a bunch of them. But this guy that I was listening to, I went to a talk of his. I wish I could remember his name, but I'm sure you could find him if you just like spent 7 seconds looking on the internet. He was talking about how these are young men who are sad and they're lonely and they're lost and they have like, a lot of abuse or not good relationships with their parents. And this is a brotherhood. This is a brotherhood that they belong to. And then they don't question the brotherhood because they have a feeling of belonging. And I definitely think the current administration understands so deeply the epidemic of young, lonely, disenfranchised, quote unquote, seemingly they see themselves as disenfranchised white men who have been pushed out of society because of this woke culture. And now it's their time to be right. The right is right again.
Yeah. And they feel ostracized and othered and wronged and victimized, and they have a worthy cause and a right to fight for their rights and their freedom, and they're vindicated and they're convicted and they're convinced. It's the convincedness, like the personal conviction that's like then collectively amplified, that becomes, I think, so interesting, because it's like, oh, if you were just in a different trance right now, if you just had a different cause to fight for and mobilize for, like this energy of conviction is powerful. It's just incredibly misplaced. And you're actually continuing to like embody the oppressor and uphold the oppressor to then oppress everyone else, also including you, bro. Turns out no one benefits under this. And any like false sense of benefiting, I think, is also what keeps those groups intact. And I think also there is this capitalizing off of this sense of separation, because even if they think they're like a part of something now, it's built on something that's so anti-life that it can't possibly like deeply, really, truly feed the part of their soul that's looking for connection. And then at that spiritual level, we're dealing with the illusion of separation, which I do believe is the root cause of all suffering. Because they're upholding separation, right? They're upholding racism. They're upholding lack of unity, coming togetherness.
Right. I mean, the Buddhist perspective is always going to be the perspective we come back to of the, but it's like when we think of, I think the reason why these relationships are so flimsy is they're actually not accurate, right? So
Right.
if you're a poor white supremacist and you feel like, oh, Trump is in office and now I'm on the right team, let me just tell you something. Trump would rather hang out with a Mexican cartel than with a poor white in his trailer. Every single time. You gave Trump the option, he's like, I'm hanging out with the cartel. I'm hanging out with a rich dude. We're having martinis together and playing golf. He
Flavor.
The poor white. Yeah. And it's the same thing with white women who think that their loyalty is to these white men, because a white man would rather be on a deserted island with a black dude who shares the same interests as him than a white woman he doesn't want to fuck.
Or probably a hot black girl too, because frankly, white women are telling us.
Just think about it from a racial perspective for a second.
Yeah.
Like if he had the option of a white woman he did not want to fuck,
yes,
or a black dude he had more in common with, like he could talk about sports or whatever, he would choose the black dude over the white woman, because the white woman has no purpose to him if he's not fucking her.
Yeah.
So even though white women, when as a white supremacist woman, you think your loyalty, you think that white man is loyal to you, he's not. He is not loyal to you. He will use you, but he is not loyal to you. And I think that is why white supremacy is so flimsy, because it's not, the foundation of loyalty isn't actually accurate. And I think a lot of white people are really jealous of community, of Black community, of Hispanic community, of Asian community. And so they're pretending as if like, no, we have this white power community, but you don't. You actually really don't. And I think that hurts.
And then we get to the way that white women let themselves and actively participate as pawns in the system, ideology, identity, groupthink, viral, insidious consciousness of racism and white supremacy.
What do you mean by that? Like, I know
white women upholding all of this when they could be making other choices, which is what I think we should slip and slide our little slithery white women selves right into.
Well, because again, we have the white supremacists that are more like out and proud, and then we have the white supremacists that are liberal, and they also are supporting white supremacy, even though they posture and they present as liberal or Democrat. They're actually understanding that the role of whiteness is something that's very important to their identity and very important to their privilege. And so they want to uphold whiteness in order to not deal with the patriarchy. Yeah. Because if you're upholding whiteness, then the patriarchy is like, whatever. It's not, you know what I'm saying? It's like, you would have to dismantle them both in order to face yourself and face the truth of society. And if you just want to avoid the patriarchy, upholding white supremacy is the perfect way to do that and accomplish that.
I heard one of my favorite authors, speaker, poets, writers, oracle, Sylvia V. Lindstedt, say this morning on her podcast, this like meditating and devoting herself to this idea of not dreaming of being saved, but dreaming of saving. And like, I know that saving can also be incredibly problematic.
Oh,
but
I see.
Exactly. Like, duh, yes, agree. And also, there was something about that that reminded me, like, as I was meditating on getting ready for this podcast, about like white women's obsession with being saved and kind of upholding that idea that not only the feminine needs saving, but like something about the like the hand faintingness of white women. Like there, I feel like there's that energy in the DNA where it's like, oh, we must just be released and saved. And thinking about Snow White specifically as an archetype, like her stepmother was jealous of her because she found out from her magic mirror that Snow White was going to be the fairest in the land. So then she had to do everything she could to kill and eliminate Snow White because Snow White's beauty and status was then going to be a threat to her. So I think white women spend so much time like dreaming of being the best, dreaming of being saved, dreaming of making it, where like Black women and women of color have not been given that same societal opportunity historically. So I think there's a different way that Black women and women of color move through the world with a different kind of like essence than white women's entitlement to being the best, or this idea that they have to achieve, and like the way that perfectionism and white supremacy are also incredibly entangled, and like hypervigilant white women who have to be the most perfect and the best and the greatest in the land. Like this is a tale as old as time.
Right. And it's the reminder that when you look at white supremacy from this condescending point of like, well, as a white woman, I care about Black women, so I am going to be anti-racist, as if white supremacy isn't demoralizing you, isn't impacting you, isn't destroying you with its own like insidious psychology. And I think it's like really condescending to think that it doesn't apply to you. And you're just like, well, I'm an anti-racist because I care about Black people. It's like, well, care about yourself, bitch, because this is impacting you and your soul and your spirit and your identity and your sense of self.
And how are you being the colonizer? How are you being the colonizer to yourself and other people? Like white women being outraged at what's happening in the world and people's rights being taken away. Like, you know, that is something that I witness all the time outside of me, within myself, like all these things that we're individually and collectively divesting from. Like the outrage is misplaced, I think.
Well, also it's like, when you're a man and you're like, oh, the patriarchy's bad for women because you know, bitches be complaining, versus the patriarchy is incredibly bad for me.
Yes.
And the patriarchy has destroyed my relationship to my emotions or my vulnerability or whatever, and examining how it affects you as well. That's, I think, a more embodied understanding of how these systems impact everyone. And when you operate from that place, it's less pejorative. It's less self-righteous. It's less like, I'm the savior, I am helping everybody because I am so thoughtful, but rather than like, oh yeah, this is toxic to society, therefore I'm a part of wanting to dismantle it.
Yeah. How am I upholding the oppressor within me? How am I colonizing myself? Like, in what ways have I made unconscious agreements to worship colonialism? Because that's a spot I haven't digested within my tissues and my trauma yet. And for any white people to think that they've looked at all the cracks and corners and in all the closets, I mean, that would be truly impossible. And still be living in this world. There's much work to be done.
Like two things I keep thinking about being also a white woman, right? Is a white woman is both the victim of oppression because she's a woman and the perpetrator of oppression because she's white.
Yeah.
And when I think about like, so what other communities like have this cross section of both oppressor and victim or being oppressed? And I'm like, oh, Jewish people, because Jewish people can pass as white and are often seen as white, especially European Jews versus like Middle Eastern Jews. And so they also have this dance of I am oppressed and I am the oppressor. And there is this way in which I feel as if there's a greater responsibility, right? When you have your legs spread apart in both ponds.
Yeah.
How do you hold these two identities of oppressed and oppressor? And how are you part of the your own self-liberation by having that understanding? Like, if you're just a white man, you actually do not know what it is like to be oppressed because of how we live in a patriarchal white supremacist world. You just don't get it. And it's just like, there is like a little bit of like a disconnect. Like, wait, what? And so it is the responsibility to listen and hear. And just like with white women, we should be able to communicate, this is what it's like to be oppressed as a woman, and explain our oppression as a woman. But we also have to hear and listen and have the curiosity to hear what it's like to be oppressed from a racial perspective. And white women have to do both, explain and listen.
Yeah.
You know? And I think Jewish people also have to do both, explaining and listening.
Yeah. And it's like not the oppression Olympics. Like, I think if we're in this way of trying to measure trauma on a scale that's linear, we've lost the plot. Because I do, like, this is something else that was coming through. I was like shouting at Siri in the car, like driving down an icy road, thinking about the way that, like, I was thinking about hierarchy versus the circle and the coven, the difference between a coven mindset and a hierarchical mindset, and the way that thinking in a circle versus like thinking straight up and down like a penis, like very phallic, very linear, is, I think, a lot of times also what we're negotiating. Like, I even find this in the way that I organize time, or like approach my day, or like approach collaborations, or approach relationships. Like, am I letting there be like a circle of like relational hierarchy versus like an up and down hierarchy? And I think you have to,
would it be a hierarchy?
well, that's what I mean, like an ecosystem. So like, am I allowing myself to exist in this like coven circular ecosystem of relation where like there's feeding and exchange of information happening, or have I slipped into hierarchy again? Whether I'm allowing myself to be in a dynamic of oppression and suffering, or I am oppressing. And I think like it is this sort of moment to moment spiritual practice of like, what systems am I upholding within myself, in thought, in word, in action right now? And I think what happens is a lot of white women get away with not thinking about these things, and they think that it doesn't affect them. And then through that, they continue to enact more violence by holding up white supremacist ideals and values and ideology in even subtle ways, in purchasing power, in self-expression, in where their money goes, in the way that they show up in relationship. And like the they is also not separate from me, which I also think is part of the whole fucking practice. Yeah, there has to be a devotion and a willingness to look at where this is present, which is where I think like the anarchist and the punk and the artist and like the like radical spiritual nun monk, like those archetypes have really helped me. Like that t-shirt you have of like the nun like smoking the joint or whatever, just like contemplating, like there's something about that willingness of like the feminine throughout time, from bell hooks to Joan of Arc, like this willingness to push through the veil. And I think it is important to also note how many like Black women have been pioneers. Bell hooks, for example. I mean, I think of bell hooks, I think of feminism is for everybody, which then just brings us full circle too.
Well, let me say two things. One is this idea of listening and curiosity, because when you listen, it's not about making it about you. So I've had lots of friends open up to me about their experience with white women and whiteness and talking about it. And that is not for me to be like, well, me and my experience and how I am with Black people. I just have to shut my mouth and hear what they're saying to me, and whether or not what they're saying applies to me, that is my work to do. It's not for me to get defensive in the moment. It's not for me to argue that like, well, maybe they weren't being racist. Maybe it was just in your head. No, I have to actually stop talking, listen to their experience, and do the work to be like, have I done that? Do I do that? Do I not do that? Am I aware of this? And like, do that alone or with other whiteys. I don't have to do that with my friend who's opening up to me about their experience being Black in America. Like, that's not for them to hold. They're giving me something to hold. And then I hold it and I contemplate it. Just like if I were explaining to a man the need of feminism and he's just like, well, why you maybe you're being a paranoid bitch and no one's that sexist. It's like, actually, no, just hear what I'm saying and then hold it. And I think what's so hard for white men, LOL, just to be empathetic to the white man for a second, but what is genuinely hard for them is that they have to hold hearing about racism and they have to hold hearing about sexism and they have to hold hearing about transphobia and homophobia and all of these things that they're not experiencing. And they have not been taught for their arms to be that strong and their heart to be that strong. And they may go lift weights and like, eat the creatine and have the testosterone, but they don't have the energetic strength to hold all the suffering in this world and ask themselves silently, do I do this? They need to process it with someone, and usually they need to process it with a woman who they're going to be most angry at. So I think if we want to heal genuinely, we have to like teach our sons and we have to teach our men and our husbands like how to hold the pain of others and not make it about you. Yeah. Just to learn from it. And if it applies to you, to like not be in this like well of guilt and shame, but instead be like, this is information I need to grow and be a better person.
Yeah. And I want to do something about it. Like, again, I understand that the word saved is like specifically potentially problematic and not quite fitting for this conversation, but that like not dreaming of being saved, but dreaming of saving. Like she was also talking about like everyone being like mothers and fathers to all of the children of the world and like approaching children and humanity and the plants and the animals like from that place of like, I am here to like be of service. Like, how can I nourish? How can I help? And like when I think about my orientation to Black women, to people of color, to trans people, to anyone who is to disabled people, to anyone who is systemically more marginalized than I, like I really try to choose that, like, how can I fucking be of service, like in this moment, or like even an elderly person, you know, like just not rushing past these moments of like the potential to connect in these ways that I think also bring us deep meaning. Because something else
of service to white men to help them hold the pain.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's the thing is
that you're good at that.
Like, service is cross-section.
Yeah.
Right. And it's to everyone. Actually, anyone you meet, you need to be of service to. Like if everyone had that mentality, that would be valuable. And even if you met a total shitbag, you don't need to drive them to the airport, but being of service to them would be something more emotional / spiritual / on a healing level. And I think that is where we have to start approaching each other is like, what is the service I can provide for the person that's in front of me?
And like the preciousness and like what are their kinks and what are their dreams and what happened to them as a kid and like can I lick their soul? Like that's something that got me interested in doula work at the start. I was like, oh, to be a doula just means to like sit at women's feet and like fucking worship them as they birth. Like I am interested in all of that sauce. Serve me that and a bag of chips, please. Like, I want to be there for that. And I think that's where, like, my breastfeeding and incel came up a couple of episodes past. And just this, like, interest in, like, because honestly, like, as you're talking about men holding space and just seeing and witnessing and listening and having this curiosity, like, the visual that I was getting was just, like, the, like, gayest lesbian orgy of all the priestesses in the temple, just, like, going down on each other like snake priestesses and, like, fingering each other to, like, the high heavens and, like, squirting across the temple and, like, dildos are being used and, like, a dick isn't needed for pleasure because actually turns out, as we have talked about, the holy sacred sperm is what is needed for co-creation, but sex is always not about that. Turns out sex isn't always about rape and making a baby. Turns out there's like a whole spectrum of pleasure inside of that is like ripe and ready for the taking. And I think that is something that white supremacy and patriarchy are also terrified of, just to like circle it back to the queerness thing as well. Because it's such a threat. Like, it's such a threat, to quote Adrienne Marie Brown, to believe in more pleasure than capitalism has programmed us and white supremacy has programmed us to believe is possible. What a fucking threat of a consciousness to believe in that and to like live for that and to like find that in each moment.
Yeah. So another thing that's happening for me on a personal level is I've been in my stories on the gram, just like posting, it is Black History Month here in America, regardless of whatever Trump says. So I've just been posting a lot of content.
Here in the Gulf of America.
I've been posting a lot of content on it, and I've been getting a lot of DMs that I was surprised by. And so one post I made was about, or shared on my story, it was a creator that was like, I asked ChatGPT what would happen if all Black people left social media. And it kind of, the ChatGPT like goes through its like AI voice, but it was basically saying that all the culture would be ripped from social media, all the trends, all the dances, all the this, all the that, like everything that makes it cool would be gone. And then what would be left was like a dork void, basically. Like, you have to look up the video yourself, okay? So I thought that was interesting. I posted it, and this white girl message, and she was offended by that. And she was like, I don't understand. Like, I wouldn't say she was offended. She was offended by it. And I just said to her, I was like, hey, man, this is in reference to how much Black culture has contributed to culture in America, how much language, music, what's cool, fashion. I mean, we could go on and on. I could write a TED Talk about it. And that is not acknowledged, respected, appreciated. There is no gratitude. It's often erased. Like, you see, like, there was another video I saw where it was like a white mom and a white girl, and she was like talking about like Gen Z slang versus Gen X slang. And all they were doing was saying terms that was invented within the Black community or the Black gay community. Like slay, that's not a Gen Z term. Like, no, like all of these things. It was
like a Black, queer, trans.
Yes, it was like so postmodern to present this with like two white faces as if this is like a generational thing versus like, no, these are cultural slang words that come from a Black and queer community that are now cool.
Right.
And they're cool from this community, and you're not even mentioning it. So I explained that to this woman, and she was like, oh, yeah. Yeah. And then we actually got into a deeper conversation about white supremacy. So it's interesting to me, like, she was threatened by this idea that like white people have no impact on culture. And rather than being like, oh, we need to celebrate and honor the impact on culture that Black people have and queer people have. And that was so interesting to me. It's like, this isn't taking something away from you.
Yes.
This is celebrating what we should be celebrating.
Yes. And it leaves actually more space for white people to get clear about what their traditions and rituals and culture is. Like that, I do feel like it's important to go on an ancestral journey as a white person and understand, like, what is your lineage? Like, if you have the privilege and resource to do that, like, what are you healing? What are you divesting from? Like, what's going on there?
And a lot of your lineage is going to, like, I'm sorry, I'm in a lot of, if you're a white person, you are going to find yourself within circles of white people every once in a while. And if you're in a hippie community, people are going to ask you to bring your ancestors. And I have never been more uncomfortable than to be in a circle of white people who are calling in their ancestors. I'm like, I don't want your ancestors anywhere near me.
Yeah.
You're colonizing, raping ancestors, including my own ancestors. And so it's like, we don't have the fucking pleasure to be like, I call in the wisdom of my alcoholic raping ancestor. thank you. Actually, I'm not interested in your wisdom. I have to go back thousands of generations till I get to like Hog and Krog, who were like worshiping the earth and the soil and the goddess before I'm trusting any of my white ancestors, okay? And that might be uncomfortable for people to look at. And I'm sorry, you just have to keep going back to go back to the Stone Age.
No, I mean,
they probably weren't even white. Sorry.
Yeah, no, we have to go back. We have to go back to the source. I mean, that's obviously clear in these times. Like, we are at a source level, like human divinity level, like separate from the divine, and we got to like reconcile our separation from God and what the fuck that means, goddess, spirit. I also feel like something that I have practiced is like connecting with the higher self energy of my ancestors and asking like the wise and well-heeled like versions, like the innocence of their like atomic soul blueprint, to just like be like, yo, what happened before you also inherited this epigenetic trauma? And like, yo, what's going on now in your quantum reality? Like, now that you're released from your human body, like whatever star nation and intergalactic blah blah you're a part of, like, what the fuck's up, Catherine? And like,
well, there's no racism in the Palladian system.
I actually, honestly, I mean, I'm not an intergalactic, like, star nation expert, but my understanding of, like, the Pleiades and, like, some of these other, like, star nations is that, like, turns out racism, like, isn't just, like, a planet Earth thing. Turns out this is, like, a larger, like, a spiritual, like, fucking thing. I mean, and that's where I do think, like, it comes down to, like, separation consciousness. Like, I don't think it's ironic that a lot of like the most profound activists and artists throughout time have also had a deeply spiritual practice. Like their feminism, their politics, their way of approaching systemic oppression has been spiritual. And something else I was thinking about just on like that scarcity mindset, because I have also noticed that with white folks, especially feeling like attacked when they need to give credit where credit's due. I was thinking about patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy thriving on scarcity mindset and a buying-based social credit, extractive culture, where you have to buy and earn and prove your worth. And you have to earn your rest. I see this with white women on the internet and their fucking businesses and their money slay boss bitch, blah blah, dick sucking, whatever the fuck, white supremacists wrapped in sheep's clothing. You have to earn your rest and pay for your pleasure versus all of those things being your birthright. I'm so sorry if I just peaked the mic. Versus all of those things being your birthright. Like, pleasure is a birthright. Like, rest is a birthright. Like, these aren't things that we should have to earn and buy and prove and go on vacation for. Like, that's fine if that's what you're doing, but also to recognize, like, this is not normal. This is not just the way things work. Capitalism isn't just like the way it has to be. I think a lot of white women also don't ask questions or get curious or dream of a different kind of world. Or if they start doing that, it goes into this place of like the village or the community and like this sort of white version of how that functions versus like looking at literally how Black and Indigenous communities have been forced to do that because they've been forced out of certain economic systems. And so to think even that like the reapproach of the village or this like communal mindset and communal living is like somehow not also us following in the footsteps of Black and Indigenous people who had to keep this alive amidst colonialism is crazy. End rant.
Yeah, no, I really agree with you. And I think the other thing that's happening, and I think the Kendrick Lamar Super Bowl is a pretty interesting example of it, is you had this display, this artistic display of dissent and a celebration of Blackness. And I think a lot of white people that were like, well, I didn't understand the word he said, he was trying to hear. And then you had other white people being like, it wasn't entertaining enough, as if As if that was like his objective, was just to purely entertain rather than to create like an incredible.
Oh, I wasn't entertained enough. That's for me.
No, it was, but my point is that like I think they're like part of what's happening culturally is people feel outside of hip hop, or they feel outside of like coolness, or they feel outside of like Black culture, and therefore they're like, I don't understand it. I don't know how to dance to this. I don't know how to move my body to this. I don't know how to feel accepted by this. Therefore, I'm going to completely reject it. Because I think like it's funny, I saw like there was a couple like videos of like, this is my white mom, enjoying Kendrick Lamar. It'd be like a totally like normal looking middle-aged woman, but she was getting down to Kendrick. Like she could move her body. I was like, oh shit, like she got her hips going, and it was interesting. Like that woman did not feel outside of hip hop. She was appreciating hip hop because the music moved her.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something about feeling outside and not understanding and then rejecting because you feel like a dork, or you're like, well, fine, I don't know how to do that. So I'm going to like double down and like listen to country all the time, whatever music you're listening to because you're afraid that you don't understand hip hop, or you're not in with it. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, I think white supremacy is so disembodied. And then you look at a lot of like Black activists, Black queer artist activists, and a central aspect of their work is somatics, because I think to engage with white supremacy, to a certain extent, you have to block yourself off from feeling. Like there's a fronting, there's a masking, there's a like posturing that is like anti-life, that's anti-ecosystem, that's like anti-unity, to the point where I think you have to like disassociate, disembody, harden yourself, like be in like a pretty reactive state in order to uphold that persona.
It's interesting when you watch Elon dance or Trump dance, like they're so stiff in their bodies and there's no connection to their hips. But
yeah,
they're also
the mother or the earth or the feminine.
Or their spine.
Yeah, like no snake, no mother, no darkness.
Pardon?
No fucking darkness. That's another thing. Like the patriarchy and white supremacy and the church's obsession with labeling like what's light and what's dark as like as their presentation of your option for a spiritual practice. And as someone who's been very interested in the dark arts since childhood, darling.
But also it's like you see plenty of white chicks like who can twerk and who can move and who can get down, but they're not necessarily, it's almost like they're taking on these dance forms, or they're taking on
for men,
but also as if it's their own, as if they're not participating in something. It's like, it's like, I think that was the thing about Miley Cyrus and the twerk, right? Because Miley Cyrus was twerking and everyone's like acting like Miley Cyrus came up with the twerk, which was like very offensive, Yeah. But was she celebrating like a certain kind of dance and people were just like placing her own ignorance on top of it? Or were people ignorant to the dance and then they were just accrediting Miley Cyrus?
All of it.
This kind of confusion that was happening, like similar to Madonna and the voguing. Like she didn't come up with that. That was from the club scene that she was a part of, and she popularized it in a certain way. Like
I mean, also
working and putting it on a global stage because she was such a huge pop star. So the popularization of something also decontextualizes it, because it's like you're putting yourself as if you're the architect of this expression when you're not.
Yeah, when you're extracting from Black and queer culture specifically, because also like drag culture, being extracted from is its whole own thing as well. I think we're seeing a lot of that in like pop culture, clown culture. Like there's this I'm at least seeing like a lot of like draw from drag, and like maybe there's like recognition of that's what's happening. But I do think it's very white to be extractive and to colonize and to take. And I think that we have to really, within each of us as white people, like look at like where we're doing that. How are we like in this hypnotic trance of white supremacy that has us thinking that we're not participating in what's being created? Like, even if you didn't vote for Donald Trump, that doesn't mean you're not a part of what was chosen ultimately. And I think that's like the deeper, like, accountability that we need to go into. I think that was like one of the things. Yeah, accountability was one of the things that we were also talking about yesterday when we were preparing for this episode. Like, what is the journey of taking accountability? Like, going from this, like, how this doesn't apply to me kind of combative consciousness, and like moving through superiority complex, moving through entitlement, moving through appropriation and co-opting and insecurity around that, moving through self-importance. Then, okay, we've got the internalized oppressor, the pain and guilt around that. Okay, now I'm getting curious so that I can understand. So now I can use all this feeling and outrage and emotion, which is energy and motion, and actually like let it inspire me to show up and do something and be an agent of change. And once white women just get the fuck over that they have privilege, and like that's that, like it's just, that's what it is. So let's not argue about whether or not it's real. Let's just be like, this is objectively true. What do we want to do with this objective truth? Like, that's where our choice and our sovereignty can come in, versus I think a lot of white women spend time like defending their lack of privilege or how they don't have as much privilege as this other white woman. So therefore, I'm just like,
well, let's take it personal for a second. And like, what is one of your most racially cringy moments? Like that you felt shame or you felt guilt or you felt like you, and you had to learn from?
I think being a teenager in the South and being immersed in like Christian church and surrounded by a lot of Republicans, like having to really be like, what do I believe? Like, versus what am I keeping my mouth shut about? And
like, what are you saying? Like, you just like, you would hear things and you wouldn't say anything, or like,
I think
let's just like, if this is gonna be called Gnarly Girls, like, let's be specific. Like, what's your deepest?
I mean, like right now, like in this moment, would I wear an American flag on a tank top? Absolutely not. In like 2010, like maybe I would. Like this, I feel embarrassed about my patriotism and my like loyalty to America, which is so funny because I did intentionally kind of like dress patriotic and like a soccer mom today, just for like the cosplay of it all. Yeah, I think my sense of nationalism and like deeply supporting a patriarchal Christian experience of the divine are two things that like I had a real lived experience around. Like, I did not pray to Mother God at 17, and I think there were certain things that I believed. Like the purity culture to me feels very white supremacist, like literally wearing a purity ring. And like the like true like, oh my God, I like saved myself, or I thought I was saving myself for marriage because I'm wearing this purity ring, and then I end up getting raped, and then I don't find I feel like I'm still on a journey to find my pleasure. And that deep sense of like self-sacrifice, like offering up my body to like the Christian white supremacy patriarchy of the South, and then having to like crawl out of that, like break up with a boyfriend, like truly create distance between me and my family for some time, like lost a lot of friends. Like that is definitely my deepest like scar, like truly having been a part of that. And then to come from people who identified, my dad now is like major anarchist, but like identified as Republicans. Like, what was it to be raised in a Republican household?
Yeah.
Like, my mom did not vote for Obama. I mean, not to like air her dirty laundry, but I don't think she cares.
Yeah.
So the stain of the family and my culture,
So I was remembering, I had not thought about this kind of since it happened, but I was like, oh, okay, this is I feel like I have two stories, but I'll start with the most recent. So after George Floyd happened, it was like COVID times. We were doing these protests in my town every week. We would like go and we would protest out in the highway and hold signs, and we were doing these protests. And so I was decided that I was like, oh, we should hold an anti-racist like group or like kind of like education thing for the parents at my kid's school. And I was like, I will like organize this and bring this together, and we'll like all come together and like talk about anti-racism before the school year started, because this was the summer. And it was a white girl and a black girl facilitating the like they were like the people that I hired or whatever to come talk to all these parents at the school. Okay, so we have like our beginning meeting, and like towards the end of the meeting, like I was like, oh, it's really been my personal jihad to like have like this deep self-reflective conversations among people around race, right? And then the white girl was like, I'm very upset by your use of the word jihad. Kind of, I don't remember exactly what happened, but she was like, you can't say that word. And it was just, all right. So like, I'm putting together this anti-racist workshop. I say the word jihad probably because, like I felt like I was on a holy war, but she was Jewish. So I don't know if my use of the word jihad was like offensive to her in that way. I don't know if she was like, you can't use the word jihad because you're not Muslim. Like, I don't know why she told me. And do I stand by using the word jihad? No, but it's like what I said as a comedian. It was the word that came out of my mouth. I could have said a holy crusade, but I didn't. But she was like, you cannot say that. And I remember at that moment, like feeling like again, she was white. I was white. Okay. So it almost felt it was like a haha gotcha moment. Like, I got you. You're a bad one. But maybe I'm projecting. Maybe I'm just dealing with my own shame and guilt for saying a word I wasn't supposed to say or was insensitive. Again, I'm not standing by it, but I remember the feeling of her telling me I could not say this. And I was like very ashamed, right? And I was like, oh. And then I did not really talk a lot ever again for the rest of that workshop that we did. So there was like 6 more sessions that we did. I was like pretty quiet, and me, anyone knows me, I'm loud. I was like, I don't want to say anything because I don't trust myself to say anything around this white woman. I'm like, I'm going to say something wrong. So then on the last day, she was like, I want to bring up again what happened that first day with you. Like, she kind of like told me she was going to bring it up to like end the class. And I was like, okay. And then the last class, she like truly kind of made an example out of me. And I was like, oh, cool. Like glad to relive this again. So
How so, though?
Pardon?
How so did she make an example?
I wish I remembered a little bit better, but it was...
You were traumatized.
It was rough. Yeah. It was rough. I felt as if she was making an example out of me.
Like this white woman using her throat chakra to say this word.
She could have unspeakable words. And then I wish I remembered better. I really do. I would have to ask someone.
And this is a white woman policing you for how you were talking.
White woman, yeah. Okay. So the reason why I bring this up is not to say that I did the right thing. I'm not saying I did the right thing.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking, wow, that the most effective way for me and the group to face ourselves. And as a teacher, I was thinking about this. I was like, if someone comes into my dance class and I watch them dance the first day and I notice a lot of mistakes, I am not going to tell them all their mistakes the first day. I'm absolutely actually not. I'm going to get to know them over time. And then you kind of like start deconstructing what mistakes are And then eventually they start to look at themselves and start to apply knowledge to themselves in order to change their own behavior. So my question is like, when she called me out in that moment as an example to point out to everybody what Tony did was incorrect and she's wrong, you know, was that more effective than me coming to that conclusion after a very successful 6-week workshop where I would then look back at myself and be like, oh, that's an insensitive word. I should not use that word. Even if I think it's quote unquote comedic, that's its own problem. And I have to look at that because I do think genuinely all of this stuff around like racial sensitivity has to come from within. You have to see it before rather than someone else seeing it on you. Does that make sense? And I think that was the thing that like when I was thinking about this like shameful moment of mine, you know, where I felt shame and I felt bad. I'm like, well, it really did shut me up. You know, I did not participate, and I'm a pretty open person. I'm down to self-reflect. I'm down for feedback. I'm DTF. I'm down to fuck around, you know? And I wonder, had the Black facilitator said something to me, would I have heard it the same way? Was it her tone of voice? So I guess long story very long is that when you're told or when you're shamed or when you're guilted or when someone's like pointing at you and being like, this is where you're bad and wrong, is that effective? Versus like me getting all the information and then reimagining myself and re-understanding myself and re-looking at my language and reestablishing how I want to speak and wanting to be more sensitive from like a heart place of like knowledge and blah, 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 blah. So again, not standing by what I did, but definitely just expressing how much like, wow, her like impact on me. I do not use that word. She's correct. You know, like never said that word in public again, except for, you know, in this here now moment, but truly would not say that word in public again. So in a way she was correct. But like, I also, it's like, I still feel the shame to this here now moment. And that wasn't even that long ago. That was like 5 years ago or whatever.
I mean, the image my higher self is showing me, not just because I'm a kinky bitch, is her peeing all over you. And I feel like it's because she was asserting her dominance in a way that is ultimately reflective of white supremacy, because I think without white supremacy, shame doesn't really exist. Like, I think shame is a program, not a natural human emotion. Like, because then I was going through images of like the animal kingdom and like, does the animal kingdom use shame? No. Like, not to say that we need to take all our cues and we're not our own species, but I also think I do think the animals know more than us and have been here longer and just like have more codes on how to be an ecosystem, and obviously we're struggling with that. So I think there's like, because then I was like, well, is it domination without consent? And it's like, well, she did tell you she was going to bring it up again, so you could have been like,
there was consent, I was there.
Yeah, you could have been like, no, don't, like, I don't want you to say this. So what did you then consent to? And I think it was an experiment between white women, and I just don't think it's ever going to really be effective. Well, I don't know. Do I believe that it's not going to be effective for a white woman to call another white woman out in front of a group? I think that she chose the right person, because ultimately it seems like you served some kind of something in that setting. And I don't think that everyone is at a place in their journey where they could like kind of take that and not be like, I actually stand by this. I think your willingness to not stand by it is the point. Like,
no, it's like,
right?
You could have the reaction to double down because it's embarrassing, right? And I think that was the thing that I found kind of interesting, is that, you know, maybe from her standpoint, you don't have to like coddle people who are saying inappropriate / racist things and doing that as part of the problem and part of my own entitlement, thinking that there was a way she could have communicated that better. I'm open to that. However, I mean, I think I bring it up and I thought of it, you know, like the reason I hadn't thought about that story in a long time, because I don't want to, you know, but like,
Yeah.
When I thought about it, I was like, well, I really think that the most effective way for racism and sexism to heal is for your own self-reflection to be able to see it in yourself.
Yeah.
Rather than someone, and then maybe someone pointing it out is important. And so maybe she did give me a lesson. I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel about it.
These are the messy waters.
Because it was complicated.
Yeah.
And because I just remember how bad it felt.
Yeah.
I remember it well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this is also white people figuring out how to do this. And there is this important space of like imperfection and like the mess and figuring it out and like discomfort ultimately. That like comfort is a colonial concept. I feel like we've said that before.
Okay, I know what it is. Okay, so I have a kid, and this was not a woman who had a kid at the time. But anytime my kid does something wrong, like let's say she lied or she stole, like there was this instance where her and her friend had like stolen something. And then the question was whose idea it was to steal, but it wasn't really important. They both like kind of stole something and then they both admitted to it and felt really bad. So I wanted to get together.
Wait, what did they steal?
It was like a little silver pig.
Oh.
Yeah, and it was from my grandmother's house. It wasn't like from a store, but they saw this little silver pig and they both like wanted it or whatever. And they each took one. So I wanted to get together with the mom and the two girls and just talk about what happened. And we were talking about it and I was like, hey, I've also stolen. And I told a story about when I stole something and how I ended up stealing this like little vase that I gave to my grandmother for Christmas. And it wasn't even for myself, but every time I would go to this is another grandmother. Every time I would go to my grandmother's house and look at the vase, I would like feel really bad. And I had to like look at it for the next 15 years of my life that she was alive,
Wow.
Oh God. So I was like, I told them that story to be like, people go through, you learn not to steal often by experiencing it, and like I thought it was important to like tell them the story because one of the girls was lying. She didn't want to admit that it happened and she blamed my kid exclusively. And my kid was like, it was the other kid's idea. I just went along with it, And this girl, Emma, she refused to say she had any part and she completely blamed my kid. And then I asked them, and so this is why I was telling them my story of stealing, because I wanted them to understand, like, I'm not judging you. I've done this. I'm telling you this is not how we function in society, but I'm not judging you. So anyway, I asked the mom because I wanted this girl to stop lying for her, not for me. I didn't fucking care. And the mom was like, I'm like, do you have any stories about stealing? And she's like, no, I don't. And I'm like, okay. And then the mom like leaves and goes and walks ahead and she's probably angry at me. I don't know. She never told me. And then me and the girls are walking back. And then Emma, the girl, was like, told me, she was like, yeah, it was my idea.
So she didn't feel safe in front of her mom.
She didn't feel comfortable telling her mom. And I understood why, and I was like, oh, okay. Thanks for telling me. I really appreciate your honesty. But I just let that go, So I think like a mother. I do think like a mother when we're dealing with hard situations and I'm not saying that woman has to treat me like a child or she had to coddle me or blah, 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 blah. But I just wonder, it's like when we're telling each other, hey, what you're doing is offensive or what you're doing is hurtful or what you're doing is whatever. But we also say like, hey, I've also done hurtful things. This is coming from a place of like also experiencing what you've experienced. Would that be less effective? I don't know. I actually genuinely don't know, but I think as a parent, I always try to let my kid know that like I've fucked up too.
Yeah, this feels very like also the perspective of like the feminine and like the perspective of the feminine being connected to that, not to go back to my notes, but that of abundance, the earth knowing that the soil is fertile, the rain will come, the sun will shine. The feminine is the trusting, faithful force of creation. The feminine is the soil and the seed. And I think there is this like need to, and actually Chandy Nicholas was talking about this morning with the astrology of this year, like needing to be mothers to ourselves, to each other and to the world, and like in an imbalance of patriarchy to like balance that shadow masculine perspective with that of like an abundant feminine where it's safe to like work it out. Because if it's not safe to make mistakes and work it out, then daddy's home and he's going to spank that bare bottom till it's red, baby girl.
Yeah. No, it's real.
Whoa, big bug on my whiteboard on that one.
So
I could use a good thrashing though, personally. I've got a lot of energy to work out.
Yeah, no, I think that to bring this to a close, because I have to teach, unless we want to do a part 2, but if this is where we're ending, I don't claim to know the answer, but I do think the conversations are what we need to be doing right now, because shit is getting racist. It's like, do you like your racism shaken or stirred up, like James Bond style? Like, it's coming out all angles, and it's not just the Repubos, it's also the demos, you know, and that we have to kind of really investigate how to talk to each other, how to talk to ourselves, and how to embody a new paradigm of not feeling the need to identify as part of a group versus identifying as like part of the paradigm shift, right? Dissent. Like, the only group we should be a part of right now is the grouping of dissent.
Be a divine disruptor. Disrupt the narrative and do not fall in line. Understand that nobody is meant to be controlled. Everyone is meant to be free. Nobody is more deserving than anyone else. We are born equal, and that is Goddess's way. And the more sanitized and the more civilized and respectable we are, then the easier we are to control, because conformity is much easier to control. And is it hegemony?
Yeah.
Hegemony of white supremacy and like wanting it all to be like mayonnaise on white bread is an agenda, because it's easier to control that shit than like a really good fucking sandwich with all kinds of stuff all over it. Drippy and slurpy and everywhere.
Yeah, no, I do agree.
Keep them starving. Keep them sanitized.
Social control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep them starving. Keep them disconnected from themselves and each other and the multidimensionality of their true nature and the universe, and how there's actually so much more than we could ever need. There's no lack of food or love or water or land or people or art or ideas. There's actually just many agendas of control intersecting at once. So how are we divesting from that in each and every moment?
All right, thank you.
Love y'all. I want to just say that we're recording this in Pisces season. I was going to propose to Tony that maybe we drop a little like video about each of our favorite self-care and spiritual practices on the Discord and Patreon as a little like Pisces season flavor for our community outside of the podcast, or we should say rather more deeply inside of the podcast. So be sure to check the description for the Gnarly Girls or the Gnarly People Patreon, excuse me. I'm also going to force Tony to record a meditation with me when we're together, and let us know if you're interested in a somatic healing workshop on Zoom. I have been seeing you in the comments asking for this. I do understand that not everyone can be with us in person, even though we want that. And also my objective of doing things online is so that you work even harder to get with us in person, because if you get a taste, you're going to want the whole platter. So yeah, just be sure to check the description. We'll link the thingy things that you need to know.
A forced meditation is really funny.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna force you to co-channel a meditation with me, because our Gnarly People Patreon is about to get some spring content drops and bops, so don't miss out while the price is good.
I love you. Thanks for doing this.
Love you too. Peace and blessings to all. We love you. Good job, everybody. Even though good and bad don't exist.